education in knowledge was already done and achieved in medieval scholastic philosophy. We know today that Descartes, the Descartes' relationship to scholastic philosopher was not only of a criticism, as you will find in current history of philosophy. He took a lot from them. And particularly he took this, the shifting of the subjectivity from ethics and politics into language, science. Now, what Foucault does is trying to go back to the other figure of the subject, the ethical subject, the subject constituted not in a constituent, can we say constituent? Not in a constituent position, but in a constituted position. The subject constituted by practices of the self. And it is in this perspective that Foucault becomes interested in what he will define, he will call les arts de l'existence, the arts of existence, living, the arts of living, of existence. A quote from Volonté de savoir. Par art de l'existence, il faut entendre des pratiques réfléchies et volontaires par lesquelles les hommes non seulement se fixent des règles de conduite, mais cherchent à se transformer eux-mêmes, à se modifier dans leur être singulier et à faire de leur vie une œuvre qui porte certaines valeurs esthétiques et répond à certains critères de style. By the term art of existence, I mean the conscious and voluntary practices through which men not only establish for themselves rules of behavior, but also try to transform themselves, to modify their singular being, and to make of their life a work which bears some aesthetic values and correspond to certain criteria of style. I think it's a quite clear definition. But now we will try to understand this passage, and to understand what does Foucault mean by the term art de l'existence, or also we will say esthétique de la vie, aesthetics of life. And the main point is that the understanding of this passage depends on a correct understanding of the status and of the location of subjectivity. We cannot understand what Foucault means when he speaks of aesthetics of life, to make of the life a work of art, or to art de l'existence, if we do not have a correct understanding of his location of subjectivity. Otherwise, we will have, as we will see, a complete misunderstanding of this concept. And this is generally true for a correct interpretation of Foucault thought that we are speaking today. This lacks, that we still don't have a good Foucault interpretation and philology. We have a lot of books on Foucault, often we have even hagiography, and Foucault treated as a saint, but a real understanding of his thinking is still lacking, to come, we hope. But we can establish as a principle, a hermeneutic principle concerning Foucault, is that a correct understanding of Foucault theories on power, discipline, etc., up to the end, like I said, depends on a correct understanding of his theory of subjectivity. And this makes the things very difficult because he never wrote a theory of subjectivity. So it's implied. Even in the last work, we do not have a theory of subjectivity, a philosophical or ontological theory of subjectivity. He speaks a lot about subjectivity, process of subjectivation, the curve of the self, but he never defines it on an ontological level. the Foucault's interpretation usually focus on I don't know, this idea of the shifting from the sovereign power based on territorial state to the what he calls population state, grounded on the governance of the people, etc., etc. But these concepts, which are very important, in order to be correctly understood, presuppose a correct understanding of his implied theory of subjectivity, which he never really clearly formulates. And in some way he always says this, and you probably know that the last text that Foucault published before dying, so the last text that he could revise for the publication, was a text conceived as an homage to Canguilhem, called La vie, l'expérience et la science, the life, experience and science. So in this text, he will, speaking of Canguilhem and his theory of the life, he will write la vie, life, la vie aboutit avec l'homme, life ends in man to a living being which is never in its place, in the right place, to a living which is doomed to err, to go wrong, and to be mistaken. La vie aboutit avec l'homme à un vivant qui ne se trouve jamais à sa place, un vivant qui est voué à errer et à se tromper. So man is a living being which is doomed to err, doomed to go wrong, to go astray, to make mistake, to be mistaken. Se tromper is very large. And then he adds again, to see how always this depends. What does this mean? This also implies a theory of subjectivity. Perhaps, est-ce que toute la théorie du sujet ne doit pas être réformulée dès lors que la connaissance, plutôt de s'ouvrir à la vérité du monde, s'enracine dans les erreurs de la vie? Perhaps the theory of subject must be reformulated, since knowledge does not open end to the truth of the world, but is rooted in the errors of life. This is a very, very important point, because the theory of subjectivity in Western thought has always been linked to truth. The subject has always been grounded, at least since Descartes, but also medieval philosopher, the subject is grounded in a constitutive relation to truth. And even if you take a French interesting philosopher that you can hear next week, here, Alain Badiou. Alain Badiou has an interesting theory of subjectivity, but his theory of subjectivity maintains that the subject is produced through the contingent encounter with the truth. So it still maintains the idea that you have a subjectivity when a living being encounters a truth. On the contrary, in this last Foucault text, we see that the theory of subjectivity must be reformulated, because in man, life is not linked to the truth of the world, but to just an error, astray. Les erreurs de la vie, the errors of life. Errors, you must hear the